There is a silent crisis forming inside modern society. People are losing the ability to think independently, yet almost no one is aware that it is happening. Most people are convinced that their thoughts are the product of their own judgment, but this confidence rarely reflects reality. When psychologists analyze how opinions are formed, a consistent pattern emerges. Individuals adopt beliefs not because they examine them, but because those beliefs were already circulating in their environment. The mind confuses repetition with truth, familiarity with understanding, and emotional comfort with logical validity. This creates a powerful illusion of autonomy. A person feels independent precisely because they never question the source of their convictions. Kahneman described this as the problem of cognitive ease. When a thought feels effortless, the brain assumes it is correct. But effortless thoughts are usually borrowed. They are absorbed from social norms, from algorithmic recommendations, from the dominant emotional climate, and because the process is automatic, the person has no subjective sense of influence. They mistake the absence of inner resistance for the presence of inner reasoning. This is why the illusion is so stable. It feels natural, even when it is fundamentally misleading. Another element of this illusion is the social reinforcement that surrounds it. People rarely challenge beliefs that others share because disagreement creates tension, and the modern mind is conditioned to avoid tension at all costs. So individuals repeat ideas that fit, and over time, these ideas begin to feel like personal conclusions. The more predictable a belief is, the more strongly the person insists that it was self-generated. Autonomy becomes a feeling, not a process. The result is a paradox. The stronger the subjective sense of independence, the less examination actually takes place. And when a person no longer examines their thoughts, they cannot detect when those thoughts were shaped externally. The illusion becomes complete, a closed system that protects itself from scrutiny. There is a widespread belief that modern people think for themselves, form their own conclusions, and navigate the world using personal judgment. Yet, when you examine how opinions, attitudes, and decisions are actually formed, a much more complex and unsettling picture emerges. Most individuals do not operate as independent thinkers. They operate as participants in a shared cognitive environment where thoughts are transmitted, not created, reinforced, not examined, adopted, not constructed. The sense of autonomy remains, but the process that should justify it is absent. The first component of this illusion is the human tendency to trust whatever feels familiar. Psychological research consistently shows that people confuse familiarity with correctness. When an idea has been encountered multiple times, the brain treats it as more credible, not because evidence supports it, but because it requires less mental effort to process. Kahneman called this cognitive ease. A smooth thought feels like a true thought. This means that a person can genuinely believe they arrived at a viewpoint independently, even when that viewpoint was absorbed passively from exposure and repetition. This mechanism operates quietly. The mind does not announce that it is choosing the path of least resistance. It simply does. And because the process feels natural, people interpret this feeling as a sign of independent reasoning. They do not recognize that the ease itself is the key indicator that no real analysis took place. Independent thinking is rarely easy. It requires effort, doubt, contradiction, and self-examination. Automatic thinking requires none of these, and yet it feels subjectively convincing. This is why the illusion persists so strongly. The second factor sustaining the illusion is social alignment. Humans are deeply influenced by the beliefs held by people around them. Conformity is not merely a social behavior. It is a cognitive shortcut. If a belief is widely shared, the brain treats it as less risky to adopt. Agreement signals safety. Disagreement signals potential conflict. Over time, this dynamic conditions individuals to select beliefs that minimize friction. People align not because they reason through the idea, but because alignment reduces psychological discomfort. But once the belief is internalized, the individual retroactively interprets it as self-generated. This is why so many people defend their views with strong emotional certainty, while lacking the underlying reasoning that would justify such certainty. The emotion does not come from understanding. It comes from identification. When a belief becomes part of one's identity, questioning the belief feels like questioning oneself. And because identity is protected at all costs, the person becomes resistant to any examination of the idea's origins. The illusion of independence becomes a psychological defense mechanism. I chose this because it is mine, rather than I adopted this because it was easy. Another major contributor to the illusion is the structure of modern information flow. In previous eras, acquiring a belief required deliberate effort. A person had to seek information, evaluate it, and integrate it. Today, information seeks the individual. Algorithms deliver content that matches existing preferences, emotional triggers, and predictable patterns. Instead of engaging with diverse perspectives, people are exposed to a narrow and highly curated set of ideas. These ideas feel personally relevant because they are tailored. But tailored content is not personal content. It is constructed based on behavioral data, not independent thought. Yet because it feels personalized, the individual misinterprets the convenience as agency. This leads to another form of cognitive distortion, the belief that understanding is increasing, when in reality, complexity is being reduced. When people receive information that reinforces what they already think, they experience a sense of clarity and confidence. But this clarity does not come from depth. It comes from repetition and alignment. The mind mistakes reinforcement for insight. As a result, an individual can feel more certain while becoming less informed. Confidence rises while competence remains unchanged, a pattern that psychologists recognize as dangerously misleading because it prevents self-correction. A subtler layer of the illusion comes from the way memories work. People rarely remember how they developed a belief. They remember the belief itself. This means that the origin is erased, while the conclusion remains. Over time, the brain treats the conclusion as something it always believed. The initial external influence disappears from conscious awareness. What was adopted becomes mine. What was borrowed becomes self-created. And because the person has no memory of the adoption, any challenge to the belief feels like an attack on personal judgment, rather than an invitation to reevaluate. Another important factor is the discomfort that accompanies uncertainty. Most people are not trained to tolerate ambiguity or hold competing ideas simultaneously. When confronted with complex questions, they default to the simplest available narrative. This narrative is usually the one most widely circulated, emotionally appealing, or algorithmically promoted. Once adopted, it provides immediate psychological relief, and because the relief feels genuine, the person interprets the narrative as their own conclusion. They are not aware that the relief is a result of escaping uncertainty, not a result of understanding the truth. There is also a linguistic dimension to this illusion. People often use the language of autonomy without practicing autonomy. Phrases like "I think," "I believe," and "in my opinion" create the impression of independent reasoning even when none occurred. The language becomes a mask that hides the absence of analysis. It sounds personal, but the content is derivative. The individual expresses collective thinking in the grammar of individuality, which makes the illusion nearly impossible to detect from within. Moreover, modern society reinforces this illusion by celebrating people for expressing opinions, not for demonstrating reasoning. Social platforms reward speed, certainty, and emotional strength. They do not reward nuance, reflection, or intellectual humility. This means that the incentives for genuine independent thinking are weak, while the incentives for confident repetition are strong. Over time, people internalize these expectations. They learn to value the performance of autonomy over the practice of autonomy. And once the performance becomes habitual, the person believes it is real, Finally, the illusion of independent thinking is supported by a deep psychological need for coherence. Humans prefer a consistent worldview. When inconsistencies appear, the mind often suppresses or ignores them rather than restructuring the entire belief system. This selective perception creates the impression that the worldview is self-constructed and internally stable. In reality, the stability is artificial, maintained by filtering information, not by integrating it. When all these factors combine, cognitive ease, social conformity, algorithmic reinforcement, emotional reward, memory distortion, linguistic masking, and the avoidance of uncertainty, the illusion becomes nearly perfect. A person feels independent precisely because they have never tested the authenticity of their thinking, and because the illusion is comfortable. Most people never reach the point where they suspect anything is missing. The modern cognitive environment is structured in a way that consistently favors speed over depth, reaction over reflection, and convenience over analysis. This environment does not simply influence how people think. It defines the conditions under which thought occurs. And when the conditions reward automatic responses become the default mode of the mind. What appears to be a personal weakness is in fact a predictable result of systemic incentives. The individual mind adapts to the structure around it, even when that structure undermines its capacity for independent reasoning. The first characteristic of this environment is overstimulation. People are continuously exposed to an overwhelming volume of information, notifications, updates, headlines, recommendations, commentary, trends, images, fragments of opinions, and rapid emotional signals. None of these stimuli require deep processing. They demand only quick categorization like ignore, respond, scroll, react. Over time, the cognitive system becomes accustomed to operating in short cycles. The mind loses its ability to remain with a thought long enough for it to develop. It learns to expect constant novelty, rather than sustained analysis. This transition appears subtle, but its consequences are profound. A mind trained to respond cannot easily switch back to a mind trained to reflect. Another defining feature of the environment is algorithmic personalization. People often assume that personalized content strengthens individuality. In reality, it narrows the cognitive landscape. Algorithms operate by predicting what will be most engaging, not what will be most enriching. They amplify whatever captures attention quickly and suppress whatever requires effort. The result is a feedback loop in which individuals are consistently fed simplified, emotionally charged content that mirrors their existing patterns. This creates a false sense of intellectual clarity. When the environment removes conflicting information, the mind feels more certain, but certainty without challenge is not a sign of independent thinking, it is a sign of cognitive confinement. A further aspect is the acceleration of communication. The expectation to respond immediately, whether in conversation, online exchanges, or workplace communication, reduces the mental space available for deliberation. When speed becomes a virtue, accuracy becomes secondary. People begin to equate fast reasoning with good reasoning, even though the two have little in common. This cultural pressure reinforces automatic thinking because the slow, deliberate evaluation of ideas is treated as inefficiency. A society that rewards rapid responses inevitably penalizes critical thought. Attention itself becomes fragmented in such a setting. The mind is constantly pulled in multiple directions, forced to switch tasks, perspectives, and emotional states at a pace it cannot fully manage. This fragmentation weakens the cognitive processes required for independent thought, sustained focus, pattern recognition, internal coherence, and the integration of complex information. When attention is divided, people process ideas superficially. They register impressions, not arguments. They adopt positions, not analyses. Independent thinking becomes difficult, not because the person lacks intelligence, but because the environment makes concentration increasingly rare. Another mechanism that reinforces automatic thought is the prevalence of emotionally engineered content. Modern platforms optimize for engagement, and engagement is most easily driven by emotion: anger, outrage, amusement, moral certainty, or fear. Emotional content bypasses rational evaluation and activates instinctive responses. When the mind is repeatedly trained to react emotionally, the pathway of emotional first thinking becomes dominant. People begin to form opinions based on how something makes them feel, rather than on the structure of the argument. Emotional salience replaces evidence. And because emotional responses feel personal, individuals believe the resulting opinions are self-generated, even though they are produced by the manipulation of emotional cues in the environment. This environment also undermines intellectual patience. Patience is essential for independent thinking because complex ideas require time to unfold. But modern cognitive habits condition the mind to expect immediate gratification. If an idea cannot be understood instantly, people assume it is too difficult or not worth the effort. This encourages simplification, not inquiry. As a result, individuals gravitate toward ready-made explanations, ideological templates, simplified narratives, binary perspectives, because these require minimal cognitive effort. Over time, the mind loses its tolerance for complexity and begins to interpret complexity itself as a threat. Independent thinking cannot function in a system that discourages people from engaging with complexity. Another structural issue is the constant comparison created by digital visibility. People observe the opinions, behaviors, and judgments of others on a scale unprecedented in human history. This continuous exposure to social feedback intensifies conformity. When individuals see that certain opinions are popular, rewarded, or socially safe, they feel pressure to align with them. This alignment often occurs unconsciously. People adopt beliefs that are socially advantageous, not intellectually justified. And once these beliefs are internalized, they feel like personal convictions. The environment thus creates a form of social gravity that pulls individuals toward the center of collective thought, erasing the psychological space required for independent judgment. The educational and cultural systems of the modern world further reinforce automatic thinking. Many institutions prioritize memorization over understanding, compliance over reasoning, and performance over reflection. Students learn to provide correct answers rather than to explore questions. Workers learn to follow procedures rather than to challenge assumptions. Individuals learn to avoid mistakes rather than to learn from them. These patterns cultivate a mindset in which external validation becomes more important than internal coherence. Independent thinking requires the confidence to deviate from expectations, but environments built around evaluation suppress deviation. Another significant factor is the loss of quiet. Independent thinking requires periods of mental stillness, time without input, without distraction, without constant external stimulation. But modern life rarely allows such conditions. People fill every spare moment with noise, entertainment, communication, information, distraction. When the mind never rests, it cannot analyze, it can only respond. The ability to engage in solitary thought deteriorates simply because the environment eliminates opportunities for it to develop. The environment also promotes a particular form of intellectual identity. People increasingly define themselves by the groups they belong to, the narratives they accept, and the beliefs they share. When identity becomes tied to ideology, independent thinking becomes psychologically dangerous. Challenging a belief feels like betraying the group. This creates an incentive to maintain consistency with collective norms rather than coherence with personal reasoning. The mind becomes less interested in truth and more interested in social belonging. Independent thinking cannot thrive where belonging is prioritized over accuracy. Finally, the cognitive environment encourages individuals to outsource not just information, but interpretation itself. People rely on influencers, commentators, experts, and algorithmic summaries to explain the world. This outsourcing is not inherently problematic, but when it becomes habitual, people lose the ability to construct interpretations on their own. They become consumers of meaning rather than creators of meaning. And because outsourcing feels efficient, people mistake efficiency for independence. The environment rewards this distortion, reinforcing the belief that thinking has occurred even when only consumption has taken place. Taken together, these factors create a system that consistently pushes the mind toward automatic thinking. Overstimulation, personalization, acceleration, fragmentation, emotional manipulation, impatience, conformity pressures, institutional conditioning, lack of silence, identity-driven beliefs, and the outsourcing of interpretation all work together to make independent reasoning increasingly rare. And the most striking aspect of this system is that individuals do not perceive it as an imposed structure. They perceive it as normal life. The environment does not feel like a cognitive constraint. It feels like reality. And that is precisely why its influence is so powerful. As the cognitive environment becomes increasingly oriented toward speed, reactivity, and emotional stimulation, the mind faces a second, equally consequential challenge: the erosion of attention. Independent thinking is impossible without the ability to maintain focus, hold a thought, and stay with a question long enough to process its complexity. Yet, modern conditions disrupt attention so consistently that sustained thought becomes the exception rather than the rule. The decline of attention is not a matter of personal discipline alone. It is the predictable outcome of a system that continually fragments cognitive resources. The first mechanism behind this erosion is attentional fragmentation. Modern individuals perform dozens of small cognitive shifts per minute: notifications, messages, tabs, suggestions, alerts, reminders, and subtle digital cues. Each requires a micro-decision and a micro-redirect of focus. Neuroscientific research shows that the brain suffers a measurable cognitive cost every time it switches tasks. The process of returning to the previous task is slower and less efficient than people believe, because the brain must reconstruct the context it abandoned. When these shifts occur repeatedly throughout the day, they train the mind to operate in short intervals rather than long stretches of concentration. A fragmented environment produces a fragmented form of thought. A second mechanism is constant interruption. Even minor interruptions, vibration in a pocket, a banner appearing on a screen, a brief sound are enough to reset the cognitive state. People underestimate how deeply interruptions interfere with thought formation. A person may be building an argument internally, connecting ideas, or trying to understand a concept. A single interruption can dissolve the chain of reasoning. Over time, individuals lose the capacity to follow extended lines of thought because the mind becomes accustomed to resetting before a thought matures. Independent reasoning relies on continuity. Interruptions destroy continuity. Another powerful mechanism is cognitive overload. Modern individuals are exposed to far more information than the mind can process. The brain responds by prioritizing whatever is most immediately salient, not necessarily what is meaningful or accurate. When overloaded, people skim instead of analyze. They form impressions rather than conclusions. They rely on heuristics rather than reasoning. The familiarity heuristic, in particular, becomes dominant. If something appears repeatedly, it is treated as true or important simply because it is cognitively easy to recognize. Cognitive overload therefore pushes individuals towards simplified ideas, because complexity exceeds available resources. In this state, independent thought becomes cognitively expensive, and people naturally avoid it. A fourth mechanism is attentional habituation. When the mind is continually exposed to rapid, high-intensity, emotionally stimulating content, it adapts by raising its threshold for attention. Slow, nuanced, or subtle information becomes harder to engage with, not because it lacks value, but because the brain has learned to expect frequent stimulation. This habituation creates impatience with complexity. People feel frustrated or bored when engaging with anything that does not immediately reward them with clarity or emotional intensity. The ability to tolerate ambiguity declines. Independent thinking suffers because it requires extended engagement with incomplete, nuanced, or uncertain information. Emotional content further distorts attention through emotional hijacking. Humans are wired to prioritize emotionally charged stimuli. Digital environments exploit this by amplifying content that provokes strong reactions: anger, outrage, excitement, guilt, fear. Emotional content captures attention more easily than neutral content and keeps it longer. Over time, the mind begins to associate emotional intensity with significance. People gravitate toward ideas that evoke strong feelings, even if those ideas are simplistic or misleading. This emotional bias undermines objective evaluation. Independent reasoning requires emotional neutrality, but hijacked attention cannot remain neutral. Another mechanism is diminished attentional endurance. Just as physical endurance declines without training, cognitive endurance weakens when individuals rarely engage in deep work or uninterrupted focus. Many people today struggle to maintain attention on a single task for more than a few minutes. This is not a lack of intelligence, but a consequence of an environment that rarely requires sustained thought. When attention is not exercised, it deteriorates. Independent thinking requires the ability to persist through cognitive difficulty, but endurance cannot be maintained without practice. Attention fatigue strengthens this decline. A mind exposed to continuous stimuli experiences exhaustion. Fatigue reduces working memory capacity, lowers impulse control, and increases reliance on mental shortcuts. This fatigue makes people more vulnerable to influence, more dependent on pre-made interpretations, and less capable of analyzing information critically. Independent thinking demands clarity, but fatigue produces a persistent cognitive fog. Another contributing factor is cognitive outsourcing. People increasingly delegate basic cognitive tasks: remembering, planning, analyzing, evaluating to external systems, devices, apps, algorithms, influencers, commentary channels. Outsourcing is efficient, but it reduces internal engagement. When the environment performs cognitive work, the mind becomes passive. The less a person engages mentally, the weaker their attention becomes. Independent thought requires active cognitive participation, yet outsourcing conditions people to expect interpretation rather than produce it. Social dynamics also contribute to attentional decline through social scattering. Modern individuals participate in many digital spaces simultaneously, each with its own norms, values, and narratives. Navigating these conflicting social expectations divides attention across ideological and emotional positions. The mind is pulled toward coherence with one group, then another. This scattering prevents the formation of a stable cognitive framework, making sustained reasoning difficult. Independent thinking requires internal alignment, but social scattering disrupts that alignment. Another mechanism is attentional misalignment. Many individuals spend significant time and attention on content that is trivial, repetitive, or designed simply to hold attention rather than expand understanding. Because attention is a limited resource, misalignment wastes the cognitive energy needed for meaningful reasoning. People often feel mentally exhausted, not because they engaged with difficult ideas, but because their attention was consumed by a high volume of low-value information. The final mechanism is the erosion of internal silence. Reflection requires psychological space, a moment without input, without stimulation, without external cognitive demands. But modern life fills every gap with noise, entertainment, communication, scrolling, checking, monitoring. Without silence, thoughts cannot develop. Internal dialogue becomes overshadowed by external signals. And because independent thinking depends on internal dialogue, its absence makes autonomy difficult to achieve. When combined, these mechanisms, fragmentation, interruption, overload, habituation, emotional hijacking, reduced endurance, fatigue, outsourcing, social scattering, misalignment, and loss of silence fundamentally alter how attention functions. They weaken the mind's capacity to engage, sustain, and integrate thought. And because independent thinking is built on attention, the erosion of attention leads directly to the erosion of autonomy. The next step is understanding how weakened attention makes individuals vulnerable to influence systems that shape beliefs without detection. That is the phenomenon the next section must examine. When attention becomes fragmented, weakened, and easily redirected, the mind becomes vulnerable to influence systems that operate beneath conscious awareness. These systems do not require coercion or force. They rely on predictability, cognitive shortcuts, and the natural human tendency to avoid mental strain. The modern environment is filled with structures technological, social, ideological, institutional that shape beliefs not by convincing individuals directly, but by guiding the cognitive pathways through which beliefs are formed. In such conditions, influence becomes less about persuasion and more about architecture, shaping the structure of thought rather than its explicit content. The first type of influence comes from algorithmic guidance. Digital platforms do not simply present information. They organize it in ways that determine what people see, when they see it, and how frequently it appears. Algorithms prioritize content based on emotional salience, engagement likelihood, and behavioral patterns. Over time, this produces a curated reality. Individuals who rely on platforms for information are not merely consuming content, they are consuming an environment shaped by invisible rules. The algorithm determines which topics appear significant and which remain invisible. It decides which perspectives feel common and which appear fringe. As a result, people internalize beliefs that reflect algorithmic incentives rather than independent evaluation. A second influence system is narrative framing. Much of modern discourse is shaped not by facts themselves, but by the way those facts are framed. Framing determines what part of a situation is emphasized, which questions are considered relevant, and which interpretations seem natural. When framing is repeated across multiple sources, individuals internalize the structure of interpretation. They begin to think within the frame rather than about the frame. Once a frame becomes dominant, it is rarely questioned. People accept its assumptions unconsciously because the frame organizes the cognitive space in which reasoning occurs. Independent thinking becomes difficult because the mind is reasoning inside boundaries it did not choose. Another powerful influence mechanism is social reinforcement. Humans evolved to seek social acceptance, and modern environments amplify this tendency. Online platforms provide immediate feedback in the form of likes, shares, approval, and visibility. These mechanisms reward conformity to group norms and punish deviation through social cost dismissal, ridicule, or exclusion. People quickly learn which opinions generate approval and which provoke backlash. Over time, they adjust their beliefs not because of evidence, but because of social incentives. Social influence becomes internalized. The individual anticipates the group's reaction and adopts beliefs that protect their social standing. This dynamic makes independent thinking emotionally risky and conformity emotionally safe. Institutional influence also plays a significant role. Many educational, corporate, and political institutions promote specific narratives, interpretations, or priorities. These institutions shape beliefs through curriculum, workplace culture, policies, and organizational frameworks. People internalize institutional assumptions because they are repeatedly exposed to them in structured environments. The expectations embedded in these environments about what is correct, appropriate, valuable, or reasonable gradually become personal expectations. Institutional influence is subtle because it operates through routine rather than persuasion. Individuals absorb the worldview of the systems they participate in without recognizing it as influence. Another influence system functions through cognitive simplification. Complex issues are frequently reduced to simplified narratives, binary divisions, or emotionally charged slogans. Simplification is appealing when attention is weak and cognitive resources are limited. People adopt simplified interpretations because they provide a sense of clarity without requiring deep thought. But simplified narratives automatically exclude nuance, ambiguity, and alternative perspectives. Once internalized, they structure thought in a way that discourages deeper inquiry. The person feels informed, but their understanding rests on narrow conceptual foundations shaped by external forces. A related mechanism is anchoring, one of the most consistent cognitive biases documented in psychology. The first piece of information a person encounters becomes the reference point for all subsequent interpretation. Influence systems exploit this by ensuring that certain narratives or data points appear first in the cognitive sequence. Once anchored, individuals rarely adjust their beliefs significantly, even when presented with contradictory evidence. Anchoring shapes interpretation without the individual recognizing how heavily the first exposure determined their perspective. Repetition is another powerful tool. When ideas are repeated across multiple channels, news, social networks, conversations, commentary, they gain credibility through familiarity alone. People mistake repeated ideas for widely accepted truths. This dynamic creates a form of consensus illusion. Once individuals perceive consensus, they adopt the belief not because they reason through it, but because they assume others already have. The belief feels personal because the mind cannot distinguish between internal conviction and repeated external exposure. Emotions also serve as mechanisms of influence. When attention is captured by emotional content, individuals become more susceptible to narratives that align with those emotions. Influence systems use emotional priming to shape beliefs indirectly. A person who feels fear becomes more receptive to threat-based narratives. A person who feels indignation becomes more receptive to moral condemnation. Emotions act as lenses through which information is interpreted. Because individuals experience the emotion as their own, they assume the interpretation that follows is also their own. Another system of influence emerges from information asymmetry. People have access to enormous quantities of information, but they do not have equal access to expertise, context, or interpretive tools. Influence systems exploit this gap by presenting selective information that appears comprehensive, but is actually curated to produce a specific conclusion. The audience believes it is making an informed judgment, but the range of available information has already been constrained. Independent thinking requires the ability to evaluate information in a broad context, but asymmetry narrows that context to predetermined boundaries. Authority cues further shape beliefs. When information is presented by figures perceived as experts or leaders, individuals tend to accept it without scrutiny. This is not irrational. Humans rely on expertise to navigate complex domains, but influence systems often manipulate authority cues through credentialing, presentation style, or strategic positioning to make certain views appear credible regardless of their accuracy. People internalize these views because authority reduces cognitive effort. Once accepted, authority-shaped beliefs feel self-generated because individuals attribute their acceptance to rational judgment. Finally, there is identity-based influence. When beliefs align with a person's identity, political, cultural, social, or personal, they become emotionally protected. Influence systems strengthen this by linking certain ideas to group identity. Individuals adopt these ideas because rejecting them feels like rejecting the group. Identity-based beliefs are the most resistant to change because they are tied not to evidence but to belonging. Independent thinking becomes nearly impossible when beliefs serve as social membership markers. Taken together, these influence systems' algorithmic guidance, framing, social reinforcement, institutional conditioning, cognitive simplification, anchoring, repetition, emotional priming, information asymmetry, authority cues, and identity pressure shape beliefs without requiring conscious persuasion. They guide what people notice, what they ignore, how they interpret information, and which conclusions feel natural. When attention is weak, these systems operate with even greater power because the mind lacks the stability to resist or question them. As a result, many individuals believe they arrived at their beliefs through independent evaluation when, in reality, they followed cognitive pathways constructed by external systems. This does not make them incapable of autonomous thought. It means the environment does not support its development. To understand how independent thinking can be restored, we must now examine the final component of this process, the practical and philosophical steps required to reclaim autonomy. If independent thinking has weakened because of cognitive habits, environmental pressures, and subtle influence systems, then recovering it requires a deliberate reversal of these forces. Autonomy does not return spontaneously. It has to be cultivated through practices that rebuild attention, strengthen reasoning, and restore internal cognitive authority. These practices are not quick nor easy. They demand consistency and a willingness to confront one's own mental patterns. But without such effort, individuals remain shaped by external structures rather than by their own analysis. The first step is reclaiming attention. Independent thought begins not with ideas, but with the capacity to focus. A person must restore the ability to stay with a question without immediately abandoning it for easier stimuli. This requires creating conditions where attention can deepen, reducing constant interruptions, limiting rapid digital cues, and setting periods of uninterrupted cognitive work are not lifestyle choices. They are structural requirements for autonomy. Without stable attention, no amount of intellectual intention will produce independent reasoning. Reclaiming attention is the foundation upon which all further autonomy is built. The second step is intentional cognitive slowing. Modern environments reward speed, but independent thought requires the opposite. When a thought appears quickly and feels unquestionably correct, it is likely the result of familiarity, conformity, or emotional bias. Slowing down means questioning the speed itself. Why did this appear so quickly? What assumption did I just accept? What alternative interpretations exist? This deliberate interruption of automatic cognition forces the mind into analytical mode. It exposes the shortcuts that normally go unnoticed. Over time, slowing becomes a habit, and quick conclusions lose their authority. The third step is examining the origins of beliefs. Most people defend their positions without knowing where those positions came from. Autonomy requires tracing beliefs to their sources. A person must ask, who influenced this viewpoint? Through what channels did I encounter it? What framing shaped it? Why did it feel right at the time? This process does not seek to dismantle beliefs, but to reveal their structure. Once the origin is understood, beliefs can be evaluated independently rather than accepted as givens. This transition from unexamined inheritance to conscious ownership is essential for genuine autonomy. Another key step is rebuilding tolerance for complexity. Independent thinking often collapses when confronted with ambiguity, contradiction, or incomplete information. The modern mind, conditioned by oversimplified narratives, tends to reject complexity in favor of clarity. To reverse this pattern, a person must engage with ideas that do not resolve immediately. Reading dense material, analyzing multiple perspectives, and examining arguments that challenge one's assumptions help re-establish the cognitive capacity for nuance. Complexity tolerance is a mental muscle. It grows with use. Without it, independent reasoning cannot withstand the discomfort of uncertainty. A fifth component is neutralizing emotional priming. Emotions are not obstacles, but they distort reasoning when they dominate attention. A person must learn to recognize when a belief is attractive primarily because it aligns with an emotional state. This requires asking, am I endorsing this because it's true, or because it supports what I already feel. Emotional neutrality is not the absence of feelings. It is the ability to suspend them long enough for a rational evaluation to occur. Individuals who master this discipline gain cognitive stability and are less vulnerable to external manipulation. The next step is actively diversifying cognitive input. Independent thinking requires exposure to competing ideas, conflicting arguments, and alternative frameworks. But this exposure must be intentional, not passive. Seeking out diverse sources, reading authors with opposing viewpoints, and analyzing interpretations that challenge current assumptions prevents intellectual stagnation. Cognitive diversity forces the mind to compare, evaluate, and synthesize rather than merely absorb. Without it, beliefs remain shaped by narrow informational environments, and autonomy becomes impossible. Another essential component is recognizing cognitive biases. People often assume that biases apply to others, but not to themselves. Autonomy requires the opposite perspective. I am not exempt from bias. I must identify how it operates in me. Biases such as anchoring, confirmation bias, availability bias, and projection do not disappear with awareness, but awareness prevents them from dominating reasoning unconsciously. Independent thinkers do not eliminate bias, they manage it deliberately. Internal autonomy also depends on developing a consistent internal dialogue. Modern environments replace internal thought with external content. People consume opinions faster than they form their own. Reversing this pattern means restoring the practice of thinking without input, structuring arguments internally, reflecting on assumptions, and evaluating conclusions before seeking external validation. This internalization rebuilds cognitive authority. Instead of relying on the interpretations of others, the individual generates interpretations and then tests them against external sources. The sequence reverses, from external first to internal first. Another step is reducing identity-based reasoning. When beliefs become tied to identity, they become resistant to change. Independent thinking requires the ability to analyze ideas without protecting them as part of oneself. This means separating belief from belonging. A person must ask, if this idea did not define me, how would I evaluate it? By loosening the connection between identity and belief, the mind becomes free to revise ideas without experiencing psychological threat. This separation is one of the most difficult but necessary components of autonomy. A further practice is engaging in structured doubt. Doubt is not cynicism, it is a method. It requires periodically questioning even the beliefs one feels most certain about, not to dismantle them, but to ensure they are justified. Structured doubt maintains intellectual flexibility. It prevents rigidity, and it reinforces the principle that beliefs must earn their place, not merely hold it by habit or emotional comfort. Another crucial step is reintroducing intentional silence. Without periods of cognitive rest, thought cannot deepen. Silence allows the mind to integrate information, identify contradictions, and discover new relationships between ideas. It restores the internal space where analysis can occur. In silence, the mind shifts from reaction to reflection. Independent thinking is not just an intellectual act, it is a structural one. It requires conditions that allow thought to unfold without interruption. Once these practices are established, a final principle must guide them. Autonomy is maintained, not achieved once and for all. The pressures that undermine independent thinking do not disappear. They must be countered continually. Autonomy is an ongoing discipline, a form of mental self-governance that requires vigilance. The moment it is taken for granted, it begins to erode. The conclusion is straightforward. Independent thinking is not a default state of the human mind in the modern world. It is an achievement that demands deliberate effort, sustained attention, intellectual honesty, and the willingness to confront one's own cognitive limitations. The systems shaping perception are powerful, but not absolute. When individuals cultivate the habits that restore attention, question automatic cognition and seek depth over ease, autonomy becomes possible again.